Hello, Smart Community friends, and welcome back to Mobility March. All of this month, we're talking all things mobility, which by now you probably know is one of my favourite topics. In this episode, I have a fascinating conversation with Priscilla Radice, the CEO of the Infrastructure Association of Queensland and also the co-founder of Contribute Consulting. Priscilla and I have a brilliant chat about so many things, and it's not strictly transport-based mobility that we talk about, although we touch on that. But it's about the mobility of our societies and smart communities as we move into the future. We talk about using technology as an enabler and tool rather than a driver, and the importance of digital literacy in overcoming the cultural and behavioural barriers that lead to the digital divide. Priscilla then tells us about how she sees Australia embracing these smart concepts and the need for brave and informed leadership to see further shifts in this space. We talk a lot about the power of language and leadership in making sure events and conversations are inclusive and informed, and how trust and transparency are key to integrating across disciplines, industries, and sectors. We discuss the emerging trends of systemic social issues and civil unrest leading to democracies under threat, as well as the opportunities in emerging industries such as the circular economy. Finally, Priscilla shares with us why it's so important that we are proactive about closing the gaps between the old jobs lost and the new jobs not yet created, as technology and the rate of change continues to increase. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Priscilla. How are you today?
I'm really well. How are you, Zoe?
I am doing great, and I am so excited to have this conversation with you. I know we've been trying to do it for a while now, so I'm glad that our calendars collided and we could have this conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you for asking me along, Zoe. It's interesting to have it in a more formal setting. You and I are quite often having all sorts of weird and wonderful conversations about lots of different things, so very big pleasure to be here.
Yes, that is very true. Okay, let's jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Well, I have a pretty diverse background. I've worked in retail, hospitality, fashion, city shaping, tourism, maritime teaching, transport, business strategy, all sorts of advisory. And I've worked for myself, the private sector, and government, and now not-for-profit as the CEO of the Infrastructure Association of Queensland. And I established my own company last year called Contribute Consulting when I left Arup, because I was very keen to spend a bit more time with my family, to be honest, and have a bit more flexibility for how I managed my career and managed all those other aspects of life. So that's certainly one of the things I'm passionate about, is my 10-year-old boy and my daughter who's just graduated from uni, and my husband, and just spending time with them and doing cool stuff. And I'm pretty passionate about fairness and honesty and looking at new ways to run the world, because I'm not sure that we're doing a great job at the moment. And we're, going through a pretty massive pace of accelerated change. And I think that we are looking far more to the past than is relevant for where our future is.
Interesting. I'm keen to jump in more to this conversation because I think infrastructure plays such a huge part in the smart space. And I know you've got some thoughts and views about that as well. So let's go to, firstly, what sparked your interest in this space? Now, you said before that you don't necessarily work in the smart community space, but I think that you definitely do. You're just bringing this different angle. So tell us what sparked your interest in the smart community space.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think everyone works in the smart community space, really, don't we? But it is, when you kind of create a nomenclature and a bit of a club around something, people can feel they're either in it or out of it, which I think is why, because there's been so much focus on the tech rather than the objectives. But I'm a sociologist by trade and a farming country girl by upbringing. So I'm really deeply fascinated and excited by cities. Cities are ecosystems. They're the communities, the structures communities are built up around them. And just like nature, they're really complex and they're full of intersections. And the bigger the city is, the harder it is to map or predict what a change in one place will trigger in another place. And ironically, as cities get bigger, they get further removed and the decision-making becomes further removed from the people who actually created them. So smart cities provide an overlay where we can have the many people involved in making decisions from all those many different aspects: freight, water, energy, food, transport, education, health. We can really think about how they come together and have an interconnected system that kind of manages the health of the ecosystem more broadly. And I think that's where there's some really exciting aspects for the smart communities, smart city space.
Mm-hmm. And you've kind of already answered this, but I'll ask you again, but what is a smart community to you? It's
how digital technology can bring people together and make our cities and communities more prosperous. I'm a bit nervous that it's more about the tech, but fundamentally, people gather in cities for safety, economic well-being and community identity. And a smart city and embracing technology can actually help to make sure that people and aspects of the city don't fall through the gaps. So at heart, it's using digital technology to build community bonds and connectedness.
And I mean, I sense your hesitation with talking too much about technology, but I think that as long as we're talking about it from an enabling point of view, I think that's what really matters. And because I think we can't dismiss technology as not being a part of it. And I know, I've said a lot, it's not about the technology, it's about the people. And it's not about driving, change through technology. It's about using it as, a platform or enabler, as a tool. And so I think that I've had lots of conversations. It's not about the people. It's about, it's about change. It's not about the tech. It's about the people. But it can't be all about the people. It's obviously about the people. So we don't need to talk about that anymore. We need to talk about technology. There's so many different ways we can, I guess, come at it. But I think fundamentally it's about doing things differently, not for the sake of doing them differently because, we're sick of doing it the way we used to do it, but actually because we can make better outcomes. We can change things to suit people, to increase quality of life, to make, infrastructure, more effective, more efficient. So we can spend less resources on that and more resources, or save the resources, but also have resources to spend on our community. So I think there's a bit of a nervousness generally about what is this thing and what does it mean. And I'm not quite sure about this in general, and it is changing and it's shifting. But for me, it has to be incorporating technology, not in itself, but in the new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, because there's so much stuff out there. Yeah.
I completely agree, Zoe. I'm not saying it's not about the technical. The technical is what will enable us to actually solve some of those big, wicked problems. So it is all about embracing the technical. I think what I was trying to say is the technical will come. It is coming, but you can have the best technology in the world and you can have it to people's doors. But if you don't have digital literacy, that's kind of the bridge between individuals and the digital technology. And so what I'm not suggesting we ignore the tech. The tech is fundamentally important and it's changing and getting on top of that. And what does it look like and how we embrace it? But it is about behaviours. We've seen in this pandemic so many of those cultural behavioural barriers to take up technology that has been there for more than a decade. So there's the tools that everyone's talking about now that have been fabulous, and now we can do this and we could do that. We've been able to do that for years and years and years. And so you can't have a conversation without one or the other, and we can't have a conversation about a smart community if we don't have digital literacy. So what parts of our community, whether it's gender, ethnicity, class, cultural background, economic background, to ensure that everybody has equality of access.
No, I love that. And thanks so much for bringing digital literacy into the conversation as well, because it's so important. And, I think we had this conversation earlier on in the pandemic when we just had one of those super cool Zoom chats that we've been having for quite a while. But yeah, just talking about that digital divide, and if you're not digitally literate, not particularly actually, I guess it doesn't matter what job you're in necessarily, but I did find, the shift away or the shift only to face, and then obviously that the drop date of, okay, now we have to embrace these things that have been around forever. There was a big, learning curve, and people didn't want to be caught out, oh, actually, I don't know how to use this. I don't know what this is. But we're all kind of learning together, and whether it's Zoom or, coding or whatever, there's so many things that we can do to increase that for ourselves, but also for other people as well. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting time to be shifting and changing, but then, like you said, using it as the tool that it is as well, and not letting it control our whole lives, I think is also important one.
We're all still working out what this means and what does it look like, as a parent of a 10-year-old son, and how you manage what is, good screen time, bad screen time, how does he connect to his friends, what does that mean socially, and not applying what I think is important to childhood based on my childhood, which is increasingly irrelevant to his. So I think for any situation, top-down technology doesn't make for, compelling places to live, and I suspect it would ultimately fail. So for me, the smart cities concept, it's actually about how do we increase citizens' participation? How do we actually start to map out what the vision is that we're trying to achieve? What are these opportunities? And then what technology choices do we make to fit into that vision rather than the other way around?
Yes, I love that. Okay. I think we have talked about why this is important. Let's go to, I know that you work across so many different disciplines, industries, et cetera, et cetera. Let's first go to Australia, though. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on how Australia is embracing this concept based on the work that you're doing.
I think it's really patchy. So I'm seeing it's definitely much stronger in the cities, but I'm actually seeing some pretty clever regions do some interesting things, regional towns as well. But, fundamentally, the problems generally hit cities the largest and the soonest as their populations grow. We don't have massive population in Australia. Our infrastructure industry and a range of other things, we tend to be a little bit reactive. But we're seeing a lot of focus in the transport space, I think, the sensor space, how do we manage pedestrian traffic, future of mobility. I think we're seeing less connectivity across kind of what does it mean from an energy, water, stormwater. Different elements are doing them within their silos, but we're not necessarily, I don't think, bringing it fundamentally in as this whole of system that can manage the ecosystem. But that will come when you've got good elements in certain areas. Then people learn from that and we start to actually stitch that together as long as we can stitch it together. I see the rail industry doing exactly what they did with Gauge. Now they're doing with their different systems. The federal body has one system. We're seeing some capital cities use ETCS. We're seeing some use the other. I think it's METS. I've forgotten the acronym. But essentially, they're doing exactly what the Gauge did, rather than looking at, well, actually, how do we come together as an industry and talk about what's the system that would work with us more broadly, and then how do they intersect? So it is a bit patchy. I think there's great. It also comes back to leadership. So I think where you've got really strong leaders who are engaging really strongly and they're willing to be a bit brave, then you're seeing some great stuff come out of that. But yeah, I think there's certainly room to move. I think not understanding what a smart city is and a definition or a framework or a common set of nomenclature that is inclusive. I know when I went to the digital twin event for Brisbane last year, I lead the Infrastructure Association. I was expecting to see an awful lot of people I knew in the room. And I think there were about 5 other people out of about 150 that I knew, because it was the tech industry. And it's like, well, if you're looking at this from your perspective and not talking to the actual infrastructure asset owners and operators, let alone anyone from the community, how do we make the right decisions? And I think you see that in energy. Energy made some decisions a little while ago around infrastructure. What did they look like? What was energy going to look like as that mix? And they made it within a silo of their own industry rather than from the perspective of economic enabling, we catalyse all of these other opportunities across the nation. What is our role in that economic catalytic space rather than what is our role as a energy company?
Yeah, and that's so interesting too, and something I've experienced as well. Actually, it was last year, I think, at a Sydney Vivid event. So, it was an event, they have a series of events in Sydney and, a lot of creative events and that type of thing. Anyway, I was asked to moderate, I think. Yeah, I was moderating a panel, and the panel discussion that we had was a very, transport planning, engineering discussion, very similar to one that I would have at an engineering conference or whatever. But looking out in the audience, it was majority women, lots of creative people. You could tell by the questions that they were asking. And I went, wow, why are these people here, but they're not at these other events that I'm at where we actually need that input? And it came down to the marketing. How is the event sold? Who were they, inviting in? And it was around bringing it back to, I think it was called an Untimed Life, what's going to happen with the future of, I don't know, mobility or something like that. And so rather than it being this is a smart city panel and we're going to talk about this, we invited people in a different way. And I loved that. And I've been thinking more and more about it, about how we bring, making these conversations and, information more accessible and inclusive. It's not necessarily about, it's about changing the narrative, right? And so we want
language is really, really important and powerful. It's like if you could have a massive kind of new strategy in a company and you have whole change management to go with that. But if you haven't adapted your language and your messages and what is important or what is the hook point for all the different segments of your company, and we certainly experience this in Arup. So, the things that are important and will drive people in the advisory space for, a data room are really different from, a pavement engineer in highways. And so how do you actually start to create the language, the opportunities, and listen to all of those different elements as well to actually make the implementation of whatever it is you're trying to change work? And at the moment, what I see is a lot of people in each different industry all talking to themselves and not necessarily engaging outside of their sectors. And that's the great thing, I think, about a smart city concept is you can actually, putting aside that kind of language, if we start to think about this technology can connect us and interconnect us in all of these different ways, and we can all start to come together to make those decisions, then there's actually that platform there to break down all of those kind of language and different barriers around what's important and what's not. And we start to make the right decisions because we've actually talked to, listened to all of the different elements of society that make up, our population as Australians.
Yes. That is so true. And I think an underrated part of it, I think it gets pushed to the side of, it will make it happen. And these are things you can't force the collaboration. You have to build the relationships. But building those relationships outside your industry, breaking down those silos, I think it's not talked about, but not actioned enough as well, because it's not a 1 + 1 = 2 solution. It's such a different way of doing things that doesn't, have that exact cause and effect, but it builds over time. And, it's one of the reasons I started the podcast, right? Because I wanted more people involved in this conversation and make it more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. And you reach out and you connect lots of different people and that, enriches everybody's lives. I think that is something we need to do more broadly. And I think that's where I started. I'm not against the tech. I just think the tech will come. Smart people are doing amazing stuff and it's changing in leaps and bounds. The quantum accelerated, if you believe in Moore's, accelerated returns theory, the world we live in now will be almost unrecognisable in 20 years' time because the pace of change is just accelerating constantly. And so As part of that, though, how do you bring people together? And I think this is that conversation about, well, actually, it's about a vision, because if you're not talking about the tech or the mobility or all these little elements, you actually bring people together to go, what do we want for our community? Where do we want to be? And then you can start to actually have conversations to say, well, how do we want to get there? What are the trade-offs that we're going to need to make? Because you can't necessarily be really efficient and really sustainable. You know, they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not necessarily serendipitous as well. So how do we actually start to go, well, the priorities for us and the compromises that we're willing to make in order to get to this point in time, this is kind of what this is our vision for us and our children's children's children and this planet that we live on. Then you actually start to have a common language and a common, the getting there. What tech do you need to get there? I think that's the easy bit. The behaviours and the leadership and the governance models for how we actually become more inclusive, that's the important bit. Because until we have a safety net for our planet and a safety net for people, will not achieve sustainability. And if we don't have a safety net for people first, I think the planet will come an easy second. So social exclusion is the biggest issue of our time.
Yeah. I was just thinking while you were talking there, it's so much bigger than just what infrastructure do we need for this? So, how do we make smart, infrastructure, whatever, but actually the governance. Tell me about what you've been up to, some of the projects and exciting things that you've been working on.
Oh, well, I work on a fair bit of different things as a freelancer. So, from a CEO of IAQ, we're very much focused around sustainability, both industry sustainability, which because it's infrastructure, if we get that piece right, it actually lifts sustainability far more broadly. Lifting private sector engagement and spend. We're seeing governments around the globe doing very big, heavy lifting as part of this recession that ultimately, debt's really cheap right now, but ultimately that all has to be paid off, and there is a price to pay, and how big that price is over what period of time. So what are those new models to kind of lift private sector engagement? Where do we need the government to do the heavy lifting, and where can we let the private sector? I do a bit of work for Queensland Health, so opportunities in health about, more transparency in data management, focusing on better outcomes. What is that governance piece? And a beyond project approach. So I'm a really big advocate for thinking about things from an ecosystem point of view. And when we take a project by project, or a transport is not connected to land use and land use is not connected to health and education. So that's my interest in the smart city space, is what role can it take to actually have us start behaving in this much more ecosystem way? And what are these new citizens participation models? Because if we don't get that right, in Australia, we're seeing community opposition and kind of that community outrage around uncertainty, around not sure where they were going. When people feel under threat and they're not sure where they're heading, and they're not sure what their future is for themselves and their children, and they're under stress, which I think we are underestimating how many people globally are under extreme distress during this pandemic, then that doesn't create a good environment to make good decisions and long-term decisions. So how do we deal with those, massive issues? And how do we work together to make the trade-offs for how we're going to grow ourselves out of that transition? When you see the stock market reaching highs it's never reached before, when we know that there are millions and millions of people without any security of job, income, housing, food, there is something seriously wrong with the system. So, I think one of the big trends that we're talking about, but I don't think enough, is that democracy is under threat. There's two kinds of capitalism. There's democratic and there's authoritarian, or you might say the polite kind and the warlord kind. And at the moment, there's a really, really big rise in that authoritarian model. And, we're in a part of the world where, that democracy is very kind of new. What does that look like? How do you manage this massive accelerating growth without leaving huge amounts of your community behind? So I think the civil unrest that will come from ecosystem degradation without necessarily getting our governance models right, when people don't have access to energy, food, water, and that becomes a bigger issue, I think there are some really kind of structural things where we need the technology to be focusing on how we bring people together rather than the tech itself.
I totally agree with you. I think that you were talking earlier about that safety net, and I think we underestimate how important that is and the effects that it has when it's not there. And that when we're acting from, I guess, a mindset or, an actual reality of scarcity rather than abundance, we can't make good decisions because people are constantly under threat. And I think that's so right. And trust, I think, is a huge component of that, right?
We're doing some really interesting work, actually. We're just framing it up with the Queensland government around, trust and what are these opportunities for creating a space for ththese really evidence-based conversations where we bring people into a room. So I think there is a real willingness. I think I don't think, the whole bouncing back, new normal, COVID normal, all of that awful language. But I think everyone really, even the virtual, people were really quite generous with each other around the mute button and our kids coming in and out. And, I'm sitting here with my dog and cat who thankfully are being quite quiet and asleep and polite for your audio. And, I saw my child get to know kids around his neighbourhood that he's never met before because our suburb's used as a rat run in peak hour. So no one lets their kids out on their bikes and walking on their own. And all of that changed. And none of us, and it's all gone back. And we all thought, we can see what it could be like. This is amazing. How do we make sure we don't, repeat those bad patterns of behaviours? But if you don't, it's that classic, is it culture or is it process? And, it's the same. Is it technical or is it people? It's actually the intersections and how they come together to make those good decisions, to make it easier. But no one makes good decisions under stress.
That's such a good quote. Pull that one out for sure. I just think that's so important. And I think it's also, like we're talking, a lot of these concepts we're talking about in smart community space are much, much bigger than, they may first appear, I guess. And thanks so much for lifting this conversation to that level because I think it's so important. Okay, well, I want to ask you about integration because obviously you do a lot of this. Your diverse background, and I knew you must have been in fashion because you're always looking fabulous. But now working in so many different spaces, I want to go to how can we better integrate across the different disciplines, governments, academia, and industries?
Look, I think it comes back to that governance model. I think there's a couple of things. It's trust and it's transparency. I think one of the things that data really brings is if you can think about where you've got open data and people can actually see what's going on, it drives conversations because people can go, hey, I've seen that there's, this pattern happening here and here. I can see what's happening in this supply chain over here. We need to get together. There's an opportunity where we can solve that. So I think transparency is a really big part of it. I think how we have respectful conversations and build trust and behaviours, because I think that, across society, every survey and how we behave has shown that there is a decrease in trust. I think the role that employers have in that, so nearly all of those trust surveys say people don't trust government, they don't trust the private sector, the business community, but they trust their employer generally, which is kind of shows the messiness of the human mind. But fundamentally, what that role is for employees to have really positive conversations. And it's making sure that for every meeting you have or for every main kind of objective you're trying to achieve, look around the room and make sure that you've got different people in the room that will bring a really different perspective. So, I chair an assurance committee for Queensland Health. And, there are people there from the hospitals, there are people from the department, there are people from the community, there are clinicians, because that is how you make the best decisions and ensure that the elements from each different perspective. There's a First Nations representative. So, being very culturally sensitive, diversity of backgrounds, but, just open up the conversation. It's a bit like feminism and women in infrastructure. Every time I'm invited to a women's event, I'm like, what male can I bring? Like, is there another seat for a male? Who's bringing the gentleman that that really needs to hear this conversation? Because when we have the conversation with, 20 women in the room, we all know what the problems are. that's not the issue. It's really making sure that we're engaging much, much more broadly. But the governance models are what provides that. I think the City Deals has a huge opportunity to really think about the collaborative networks that we create across the 3 levels of government and the private sector. And it gives the opportunity to really talk about that vision. There's a long-term kind of plan to it, and we can really stitch that digital and the technology in as part of that connecting infrastructure. I think how we frame the City Deals into the future has a really, and there's regional deals, there's a few different things. I think it needs some adjustment and refinement, but the concept is still incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the concept is super valuable, and I've enjoyed being involved in some of the earlier discussions and seeing it to come. I'm looking forward to see it come to fruition in a sense of, or in a way that can really serve the community and not just be another great idea on paper, but not in reality. So I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, cool. Let's talk about the future now. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Look, I think for me, some of that's the governance and civil unrest. I don't think there's enough focus on how severe that could be. Energy is enormous. So, I'm not a Queenslander by birth. I'm from Western Australia, but I've lived here for 12 years and have, had my child here and have very much learnt to love the place. And I'm only really just starting to understand the ingredients that Queensland has from an energy, from a water, from a place geographically, but the ingredients that we have to really be a fundamental powerhouse of these new emerging industries. We have a set of characteristics that could be incredibly powerful if we can really kind of be a bit brave. So things like green steel, where we've got a renewable energy base in Queensland, that could actually mean that our manufacturing industry can actually be a big part of that driver around hydrogen. What does that look like? And what do we enable? What can we enable to be built here? I think the circular economy, people keep talking about it within a project space or a city space. But fundamentally, if you think about if the globe adopted circular economy principles, then the level of trade and shipment and import-export, those logistical supply chains, and when you think about blockchain, 3D printing, the amount of transport, the amount of shipment, the amount of movement of raw goods to be created somewhere else and then shipped back to other markets, all of that would fundamentally change, and all of those patterns would unstitch themselves. So that how we actually approach circular economy principles linked to a governance model, and if we're actually going to take, achieving the SDGs and actually reduce, the next decade is our window of opportunity to fundamentally make the right decisions so that we don't reach a tipping point that is, completely irreversible for the health and well-being of the planet and people. So I think that those intersections and how energy makes a decision with transport. So how many transport people do you know that talk about autonomous electric vehicles, flying cars, but they don't understand the conversation around baseload energy and the distribution and what does that mean? So it's that trend for how we actually create transparency. And AI has a big role in that. I mean, there's a whole dark side to technology, privacy, security, equality, profiling. It very much reflects the society we live in. So, if it's not based from a community well-being perspective, then we could get some really poor outcomes. But you think about what AI can do for transparency, for quick understanding, for recognising those patterns and really driving the next wave of productivity. I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I also think that if we don't have all of those people in the room, then we will get some really poor outcomes, because you'll only take it from, the loudest voice or whatever, or, if we only think about transport in a mode sense rather than all these other things. And it can really not just like slow down, well, it can significantly slow down, I guess, the right progress, but also it can stop things in their tracks a lot of the time. And then we, maybe we revisit them later when we've thought a bit about it more broadly. But yeah, I think it's something that in this smart community space. And like we were talking about earlier, everyone's in this space because everyone has to be in this space.
Yeah.
And that's the only way we're going to get those good outcomes that we're actually after.
Yeah. And it's a necessity. It is our world. It brings so many benefits, but it's also, if we're not empowering people, then swathes of people will be left behind. The one thing history does tell us is that every time a really massive new technology disrupts everything, then jobs are lost. Double or triple the amount of jobs are created, but it normally takes a 10 to 15-year window. And we know that. So if what we should be doing now is really ensuring that that gap doesn't exist, because that gap of unemployment, that job of whole, regions who are reliant on industries that won't be there in the future, that becomes a generational issue that is very hard to recover from. So if we can start to map that out now and actually be supporting the skills, the training, and creating those jobs sooner and narrowing that gap, then we're only going to go onwards and upwards. But if we're not proactive in that, then that is what becomes the really big issue.
I agree. And I think we'll leave it at that. It's been so great to speak with you, Priscilla, in this, for this podcast. I know we have lots of conversations outside recording them, but it's been great to have you. And thank you so much for sharing just your insights and perspectives and bringing the conversation to that high level. I really appreciate it.
Oh, sorry, it's such a pleasure. Thank you very much. And I always learn so much from you. I think that's one of the things I have loved about this pandemic and tech, is how many people who are tech savvy have just jumped in and are running meetings. And then because they've got the tech ability, they get to have a voice in a meeting that if it had been around a boardroom, they might not have been invited, or they might not have had the voice. So I think that enabling the next generations to actually have a proper say in the decisions that we make, especially with debt and infrastructure, it's really, really important. So I've always learnt so much from you. So thank you, Zoe.
Oh, thank you so much. I just have one last question, very easy. How can people connect with you?
Oh, I'm on LinkedIn, and feel free, or my email is on the IAQ website as well. So if you can't find me on LinkedIn, I've got a pretty not common name, so I think I'm fairly easy to find.
Yes, Priscilla Radice. You can definitely find you on LinkedIn. Not too many people with the same name. But yeah, thanks again for coming onto the podcast, and I look forward to our next conversation and working together in the future.
Brilliant. You too. Thank you, Zoe. Happy Friday. Bye.
You too. Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.